There are strategic victories that are achieved not through military conquest, but through economic positioning that places adversarial powers on the borders of countries they seek to influence. On January 16, 2026, when Canada signed a trade agreement with China that reduced tariffs on electric vehicles and agricultural products, most analysis focused on the immediate economic benefits for Canadian farmers and consumers. What the analysis missed was that Chinese strategic planners had been working toward this outcome for years as part of a broader objective, establishing economic presence in North America that would give Beijing influence over the continent's largest economy through partnership with its northern neighbor. The Canada-China trade agreement was not an isolated commercial transaction. It was the visible culmination of a multi-year Chinese strategy to position Canada as a platform for accessing North American markets, resources, and strategic infrastructure that direct Chinese engagement with the United States could not achieve. American security officials who reviewed intelligence assessments of Chinese activities in Canada during late 2025 and early 2026 recognized a pattern that civilian trade negotiators had missed. China was systematically building economic relationships with Canada that would serve the same function that military bases serve in traditional geopolitical competition. These were not facilities for projecting military power. They were positions for exercising economic leverage and gathering intelligence about North American industrial capacity, resource flows, and technological development. Most people believe that geographic proximity determines strategic influence, and that Canada's location bordering the United States makes it naturally aligned with American interests. The assumption is that Chinese influence in the Western Hemisphere is limited to distant relationships with Latin American countries, and that North America remains securely within the American sphere of influence. That assumption reflects an understanding of geopolitics that does not account for how economic integration can achieve strategic objectives that military presence historically provided. China does not need military bases in Canada to influence North American affairs if Chinese companies control critical infrastructure, if Chinese investment shapes Canadian industrial development, and if Canadian economic policy is oriented toward accommodating Chinese interests. The infrastructure dimension of China's Canada strategy revealed the most concerning aspects for American security planners. Chinese state-owned enterprises had been negotiating partnerships in Canadian port development, railway expansion, telecommunications infrastructure, and energy projects that would give Beijing visibility into and potential control over systems that connect to American territory. The Port of Prince Rupert, which serves as Canada's closest major port to Asian markets, and which handles cargo destined for the American Midwest through rail connections, had been the subject of Chinese investment proposals that would provide Chinese shipping companies with priority access and operational control over terminal facilities. The proposals were structured as commercial partnerships that would increase port capacity and efficiency while generating revenue for Canadian governments. But American security officials noted that operational control over Prince Rupert would give Chinese entities the ability to monitor cargo flows between North America and Asia, to prioritize Chinese shipping over other traffic during periods of competition or conflict, and to potentially disrupt supply chains serving American markets if Beijing determined that economic pressure against the United States served Chinese interests. The rail infrastructure connecting Canadian ports to the American border represented another area where Chinese investment was creating potential leverage points. Canadian National Railway and Canadian Pacific Kansas City operate integrated networks that move cargo between Canadian ports and American destinations. Chinese companies had proposed investments in rail terminal facilities, container handling systems, and logistics management platforms that would modernize operations while giving Chinese entities access to data about North American cargo movements. The data dimension was particularly concerning to American intelligence agencies. Modern logistics systems generate detailed information about what is being shipped, where it is going, who is sending it, and when it will arrive. This information, aggregated across thousands of shipments, provides insights into industrial activity, resource consumption, and economic trends that have strategic intelligence value. If Chinese companies operating in Canadian transportation infrastructure could access this data, they would possess detailed knowledge about North American economic activity that could inform Chinese industrial policy, trade negotiations, and strategic planning. The information would not be classified military intelligence, but it would be commercially and strategically valuable in ways that could advantage Chinese companies and Chinese government planning. The telecommunications dimension created even more direct security concerns. Huawei and other Chinese telecommunications companies had been pursuing contracts with Canadian carriers to provide 5G network infrastructure, despite American pressure on Canada to exclude Chinese equipment from critical communications systems. The January 16th trade agreement, while not directly addressing telecommunications, created a political environment in Canada where excluding Chinese companies from major infrastructure projects would be more difficult to justify. If Canada was welcoming Chinese partnership in automotive and agricultural trade, then categorical exclusion of Chinese companies from telecommunications would appear inconsistent and would face political pressure from constituencies that benefited from Chinese economic engagement. American security agencies had spent years documenting concerns that Chinese telecommunications equipment contained capabilities for intelligence collection, data exfiltration, and potential network disruption that could be activated remotely during conflicts or diplomatic crises. The prospect that such equipment might be integrated into Canadian networks that connect directly to American communications infrastructure was viewed as a fundamental security vulnerability. The technology transfer dimension revealed another aspect of China's Canada strategy that concerned American officials. Chinese companies and research institutions had been proposing partnerships with Canadian universities and technology firms that would provide Chinese entities with access to research, intellectual property, and technical expertise developed in Canadian institutions. The partnerships were framed as mutually beneficial arrangements, where Canadian researchers would gain access to Chinese funding, markets, and manufacturing capacity, while Chinese partners would acquire knowledge and technologies that would advance their own industrial development. But American officials noted that many of the technologies involved had dual-use applications that could support Chinese military capabilities or could undermine American technological advantages in strategic sectors. Canadian quantum computing research, artificial intelligence development, advanced materials science, and aerospace engineering all represented areas where Chinese partnership could provide Beijing with capabilities that would narrow technological gaps with the United States. The concern was not that individual partnerships would transfer complete technologies, but that systematic Chinese engagement with Canadian research institutions would provide incremental knowledge gains that would accumulate over time. The critical minerals dimension connected Chinese strategy in Canada directly to supply chain vulnerabilities that American industrial policy was attempting to address. Canada possesses significant reserves of lithium, rare earth elements, cobalt, and other materials essential for batteries, electronics, and advanced manufacturing. Chinese companies had been systematically pursuing partnerships with Canadian mining companies and had been offering to finance mineral processing facilities in Canada that would refine Canadian resources for export to Asian markets. The processing dimension was strategically significant because it determined where value was captured and where supply chain dependencies were created. If Canadian minerals were shipped to China for processing into battery components, electronic materials, or manufacturing inputs, then North American manufacturers would depend on Chinese processing capacity for access to Canadian resources. American officials had been attempting to encourage development of North American mineral processing capacity that would keep critical materials supply chains within Allied territories. Chinese investment in Canadian mineral processing was creating an alternative development path, where Canadian resources would be integrated into Chinese supply chains rather than American ones. The energy dimension revealed how Chinese strategy in Canada intersected with American energy security concerns. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of oil to the United States and provides natural gas and electricity that American regions depend on for energy security. Chinese companies had been proposing partnerships in Canadian energy infrastructure, including oil sands development, natural gas liquefaction facilities, and electricity transmission systems. The partnerships would provide Chinese entities with visibility into North American energy flows and would create relationships that could complicate American efforts to restrict Chinese access to energy resources during future crises. If Chinese companies held stakes in Canadian energy projects, then Canadian governments would face Chinese pressure to maintain energy exports during any scenarios where the United States sought to limit Chinese access to Western Hemisphere energy supplies. The financial dimension showed how Chinese institutions were creating economic relationships with Canada that would give Beijing leverage during trade disputes or diplomatic confrontations. Chinese banks had been offering financing for Canadian infrastructure projects at interest rates and terms that Western financial institutions could not match. Chinese sovereign wealth funds had been investing in Canadian real estate, resource companies, and technology firms at valuations that provided attractive returns for Canadian sellers, while giving Chinese entities ownership stakes in strategic Canadian assets. The cumulative effect of these financial relationships was to create Canadian constituencies that would resist policies aimed at restricting Chinese economic engagement. Companies that had accepted Chinese investment, projects that depended on Chinese financing, and individuals who had profited from Chinese purchases would form political coalitions opposing measures that would limit Chinese economic access to Canada. American officials recognized this as a deliberate strategy to make Canadian economic disengagement from China politically difficult, even if security concerns suggested that such disengagement was strategically necessary. By the time security risks became undeniable, the economic relationships would be so extensive that unwinding them would impose costs that Canadian political systems would resist. The intelligence dimension revealed that Chinese security services had been systematically using economic engagement as cover for intelligence collection activities in Canada. Business delegations, academic exchanges, and investment due diligence processes all provided opportunities for Chinese intelligence officers to gather information about Canadian, and by extension American, industrial capabilities, technological developments, and strategic planning. The proximity between Canada and the United States meant that Chinese intelligence activities in Canada could support collection efforts targeting American facilities, personnel, and information. Canadian cities close to the American border provided locations where Chinese intelligence officers operating under business or academic cover could meet with American sources without attracting the attention that meetings in the United States would generate. American counterintelligence agencies had been sharing information with Canadian counterparts about suspected Chinese intelligence activities, but the political environment in Canada, following the January 16 trade agreement, created pressure to avoid actions that might be perceived as targeting Chinese nationals for reasons that appeared discriminatory or politically motivated. The Arctic dimension revealed the longest-term aspect of Chinese strategy in Canada. As climate change opens Arctic shipping routes and makes Arctic resources more accessible, Canada's northern territories are becoming strategically significant in ways that did not apply during previous eras when ice conditions prevented regular navigation and resource development. China has described itself as a near-Arctic state, despite having no Arctic territory. And Chinese officials have been explicit that Beijing seeks to participate in Arctic development and governance, regardless of whether Arctic nations welcome Chinese involvement. Chinese partnership with Canada provides Beijing with a pathway to Arctic engagement that would be much more difficult if China had to negotiate independently with the United States, Russia, and Nordic countries that actually possess Arctic territories. Chinese investment in Canadian Arctic infrastructure, Chinese participation in Canadian Arctic shipping, and Chinese access to Canadian Arctic resources would all serve Chinese objectives to ensure that Arctic development does not occur under exclusive control of Arctic nations. From Beijing's perspective, Canada represents the most willing Arctic nation to accommodate Chinese Arctic interests, because Canada faces fewer security threats from China than Russia does, and because Canadian Arctic development requires capital that Chinese entities can provide. The strategic coherence of Chinese activities in Canada became apparent when American intelligence analysts mapped the full range of Chinese initiatives. Infrastructure investments that would provide monitoring and leverage points, technology partnerships that would narrow capability gaps, financial relationships that would create political constituencies supporting Chinese engagement, intelligence activities that would collect information about North American capabilities, and Arctic positioning that would support long-term Chinese presence in the hemisphere. This was not a collection of unrelated commercial transactions. This was a coordinated strategy to establish Chinese economic presence in North America through partnership with Canada that would achieve objectives that direct engagement with the United States could not accomplish. The implications for American security planning were profound. The United States had structured its strategic posture assuming that Canada would remain aligned with American interests and that threats to North America would come from distant adversaries who would need to project power across oceans to threaten American territory. If China could establish economic presence in Canada, then that presence would be positioned directly on the American border, with the ability to influence North American economic systems from within, rather than projecting power from outside. The challenge for American policymakers was that the mechanisms for responding to traditional military threats were inappropriate for addressing economic threats that operated through commercial relationships, investment partnerships, and technology transfers. Tariff threats and trade restrictions might slow Chinese economic engagement with Canada, but they were creating exactly the political dynamics in Canada that made Chinese partnership more attractive to Canadian policymakers seeking alternatives to American economic pressure. The more aggressively the United States attempted to restrict Canadian-Chinese economic relationships, the more Canada felt compelled to defend its sovereign authority to negotiate trade agreements with any country, regardless of American security concerns. The American pressure was strengthening Canadian determination to pursue Chinese partnership, rather than deterring it. The European dimension revealed that other American allies were watching the Canada-China dynamic to assess whether similar partnerships might serve their interests. If Canada could engage economically with China while maintaining its other international relationships, then European countries facing American pressure to restrict Chinese engagement might conclude that accommodating Beijing was compatible with their security partnerships with Washington. The demonstration effect was concerning to American officials who were attempting to build coalitions of allied countries that would collectively restrict Chinese access to Western technology, capital, and markets. If major allies like Canada were defecting from this approach in favor of bilateral engagement with China, then the coalition strategy would fail, and would leave the United States increasingly isolated in its confrontational approach to Beijing. The timing of Chinese strategy in Canada appeared calculated to take advantage of American political dysfunction and trade policy chaos. When the United States was threatening tariffs against its closest allies, when American reliability as a partner was being questioned, and when American trade policy was generating economic uncertainty, Chinese offers of predictable partnership and stable economic relationships became more attractive to countries seeking alternatives. Beijing did not need to explicitly frame Chinese partnership as an alternative to American alliance. The contrast between erratic American trade policy and patient Chinese economic engagement spoke for itself. Countries comparing the two approaches would recognize that Chinese partnership offered benefits without the political drama and economic uncertainty that characterized relationships with the United States under Trump. The sophistication of Chinese strategy was that it achieved strategic objectives without requiring Canada to formally abandon its alliance with the United States or to adopt hostile positions toward American interests. Canada could maintain military cooperation through NORAD, could continue security intelligence sharing, and could remain rhetorically committed to the Canada-US partnership, while simultaneously building economic relationships with China that served Beijing's strategic interests. This approach allowed China to gain presence in North America without triggering the defensive reactions that overt hostile action would provoke. By the time American officials recognized the strategic implications of Chinese economic engagement with Canada, the relationships would be sufficiently developed that unwinding them would require confronting established interests and disrupting economic activities that Canadian constituencies valued. The resource dimension showed how Chinese strategy in Canada was designed to secure access to materials that Beijing viewed as strategically essential. The lithium, rare earths, uranium, timber, water, and agricultural products that Canada possesses in abundance are all resources that China needs to sustain industrial development, feed its population, and reduce dependence on suppliers who might restrict access during conflicts or diplomatic crises. By establishing economic relationships with Canada that provide reliable access to these resources, China reduces its vulnerability to American pressure and creates supply chains that do not depend on maritime routes that the United States could interdict during confrontations. Overland and Arctic shipping routes from Canada to Asia would be far more difficult for American military power to disrupt than the sea lanes through the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean that currently carry most China-bound resource shipments.